Councillor Neufeld, seconded by Councillor Paul Davidson. All in favor? Opposed? Carried. The public hearing is hereby adjourned. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to move right into our council meeting for September 3rd, and I'm going to call that meeting now to order. Our first order of business is the adoption of the minutes of the council meeting held August 18th, 2014. Do we have a mover? Moved by Councillor Lefebvre, seconded by Councillor Morrison. Are there any errors or omissions in those minutes? Seeing none, all in favor? Opposed? And that's carried. Thank you. We're now moving into approval of our agenda this evening. I do have one change, and I'm looking for a mover and a seconder for the following recommendation: that agenda item 4E regarding the unsightly property at 359 Hackberry Place be removed from the agenda, and that the September 3rd, 2014 council meeting agenda be approved as amended. And I see Councillor Powell as a mover and Councillor Morrison as the seconder. And any discussion? I understand that that property has been brought into compliance, which is why we're removing it. All those in favor? Opposed? And that's carried. Our agenda is approved as amended. We have one piece of correspondence this evening, ladies and gentlemen, and this is from the Parksville and District Chamber of Commerce, and it's a request for support from Oceanside Initiative's Business Attraction Tools project. There is a recommendation to receive. Moved by Councillor Lefebvre, seconded by Councillor Powell Davidson. Discussion. Councillor Morrison.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. An alteration to the motion, would that be made under new business? And if we're going to be making any...
You could certainly do that under new business, absolutely. Councillor Greer.
Thank you, Your Worship. I wasn't very happy with giving the 2250 away. However, after talking to Mr. Burton tonight, he assured me this would be the last time they can come to council for money. I think...
Let the record to reflect there's someone that's very uneasy in the audience right now, stating the opposite. Nonetheless, carry on.
$2,250 seems like a drop in the bucket to me. It's like spending $5,000 to get the rail service up to Parksville. I just don't see where that amount of money can do much. He assures me, though, after my talk to him tonight, that this is well spent with the money that he's already received from Qualicum, apparently, to get him to the stage where he goes to the RDN for a larger sum of money. But he did assure me, I said, well, hopefully, he said, this will last for 3 months. And I said, then you'll be coming back after 3 months. And he said, no, he wouldn't be. So with that, I could probably be in favor of spending the $2,250. But you know, $2,250 does not mean much when you're trying to promote what he's trying to do. And I appreciate the fact that he's working hard at trying to bring business into the city. I still believe that we should be spending more money on tourism. And of course, I'd like to spend more money on improving our beach. We have such a wonderful park, but our beach is not the best. We could spend a lot of money on our beach to manicure it every year, because really the people come for the beach. We should also be promoting our tourism in the way of tournaments. We've had massive support in tournaments in Parksville all summer with the volleyball. This must bring in millions of dollars and put a lot of bums in beds, I'm sure. And also our tournaments with the baseball. We've had huge big tournaments all summer with our softball in the park. And of course we have the sandcastles and we have the Kids Fest, and we also next week we have a big hockey tournament coming into town. So I think money should be spent on this type of thing, looking after the business we've already got and maybe encouraging more tournaments. We could be known as the tournament capital of BC because we do have some pretty good facilities. I guess all we need now is maybe a good track, and we could attract the BC Summer Games or Senior Games. But anyways, hopefully he's going to spend the money wisely, and I'm taking his word that he won't be back in 3 months. And so with that, I will certainly support the 2250, although I have my reservations. Thank you.
Okay, and I'm looking for a very short conversation if there should be a motion under new business for this item. Go ahead, Councillor Paul Davidson.
Thank you, Worship. I just have a quick question through you to the staff. Can you refresh my memory, please? How much did the City of Parksville contribute to this initiative previously?
Mr. Manson? I know we made a small contribution. I can't remember the exact figure.
I'm sorry, I can't remember it either, Your Worship. I'd have to look it up.
All right, well, yeah, thank you for pointing that out. I can't quite see from this seat here. Mr. Burden, what was our contribution? $10,000, okay. Yes, yeah, and that is very much what we're talking about here. Okay, so, answers your question. Any further discussion on this simple motion to receive at this time? All right, all those in favor? Opposed? That's carried. Thank you. Moving on. We're into the reports, ladies and gentlemen, and we have a report from Mr. Russell. Could you give us the background with respect to the fence heights near retaining walls?
If I may, Your Worship, staff has responded to Council Resolution 1408 that staff be directed to review the procedures and regulations regarding fence height restrictions for fences constructed on or near retaining walls, provide options and recommendations for Council's consideration. And basically the background section provides some detail on that, as well as analysis and recommendations as per the report.
All right, so you have staff's recommendation. What say you, Council? Councillor Morrison.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'll move the recommendation.
All right, we have a motion on the floor, seconded by Councillor Lefebvre. Discussion on that now motion. Councillor Powell Davidson.
Thank you, Your Worship. I have a question. I'm not sure who to direct it to, but I wonder if an amendment to that motion could be made to the effect of where the problem does exist. I know it's a very unique problem, and we have not had a lot of complaints with this, but I did visit the people whose home was affected by this, and it is a problem for them, and I would like to add to this this recommendation that where the problem does exist, that we encourage the developers, the builders, to work with the property owners that are living on the lower end of the property that has the raised cement retaining wall plus a fence on top of it, so that they can come up with some kind of a solution before it's built. Because I think, you know, we may not have this as a regular occurrence, but it certainly is a problem for these people that are living with that situation.
Well, I know that our staff have in the past always tried to encourage being as harmonious to your neighbors as you possibly can. I just wonder if that resolution or that potential amendment really doesn't provide a direction. It's just encouraging staff to encourage. Is that what you're talking about?
Well, you're right, Your Worship. It really is a weak suggestion, or weak amendment, if it is an amendment. However, I would like Council to discuss that, because I would like us to not, you know, just close the barn door on this issue. I think that it has the potential to come back again, and I'd like us to leave the door open for this to be revisited on perhaps a case-by-case situation. So I'm looking to Council for some discussion on this and possibly some suggestions for staff.
Okay, well, I'll pass it around here, and we'll get a sense of where everybody's at. Go ahead, Councillor Greer.
Thank you, Your Worship. I agree with Councillor on the fact that this is a problem. On Humphreys Street especially, I think this is where you were talking, and there's more than one person affected. There's maybe a dozen or so affected, and I was involved in a conversation with most of those people. And they were pretty devastated, and I had brought something forward at a council meeting after that situation where we would take a look at it, and obviously staff has taken a look at it, but they've come up with the same answer. I think building a 4-foot retainer wall and then putting another 6-foot fence on top of that is just too much. So where a retainer wall is required, if it's 3 feet or 4 feet, then the ultimate height should only be 6 feet. Because and we won't run into this very often, but if we do run into it again, we should solve that problem before it happens, because these people were devastated, and it did cost them money on a couple of homes that were sold. They lost some value because of it. So we shouldn't be in the business of harming people that way. So we should take a look at it and make sure that the outside height is maybe no more than 6 feet, regardless of the retainer wall, because it was like being in the backyard of a prison on that street. So it wasn't a very pleasant situation. So we should do something, and I agree with Councillor.
Okay, I'm going to see Councillor Powell here shortly, but just so Council is aware, there is draft wording, as you know, on page 17. If that is something you want to pursue, you certainly have that option. Go ahead, Councillor Powell.
Thank you, Your Worship. I too went, after you brought it forward, Councillor Greer, I went and knocked on doors as well, and I did go in the backyard, and it was horrendous, the height. And, well, I understand it hasn't happened very many times, and to rewrite it, but I agree with both Councillor Greer and Councillor Powell Davidson that have a maximum height combined with the wall and the fence of 6 feet. Because what happened to those properties is affected, and it was unintentional. And I know I did speak with staff, and they did work with the developer to try and resolve that. And I think 5 feet instead of 6. I would support a change to this motion that we add that piece in it, that if there's a retaining wall and a fence, that find it is no higher than 6 feet.
Okay, hold on. We'll certainly get there, but you do have some draft, very short change here. Is that change going to be something that you're all supportive of? Because that makes it a lot clearer. If we're going to amend that motion, we could simply include it as to bring in a process to ultimately bring this draft into fruition. So just keep that in mind. You want to make an amendment then?
Yes, I will make the amendment. And that when a retaining wall and a fence combined, when a retaining wall needs to be put in there, that the retaining wall plus the fence be no higher than 6 feet.
Let me just go to our CIO, Mr. Manson.
I would suggest, Your Worship, that that's a major change. I think you should defeat the first motion and then go to a new motion to address that issue.
I don't know if I agree with you. Let's ask our almost parliamentarian secretary here. I think that you could easily make an amendment to the second portion of this motion, directing staff to begin that bylaw process. It wouldn't. I mean, it's not a friendly amendment, but am I stretching? Go ahead.
Your Worship, with great respect, yes, you're stretching.
Okay. So I agree with Mr. Manson. So very good. All right, Council. Well, you heard the good advice that we're getting from the folks that we pay well to give us good advice. Go ahead, Councillor Lefebvre. I'm not going to entertain any amendment, but we're going to vote on this at some point. If you really need to speak to it now, go ahead.
Thank you, Your Worship. I have a question through you to the Director of Community Planning. On page 17 that the Mayor just referred to, with the way it's written there, that you have what you've proposed, would that satisfy would that amendment satisfy the issue with regards to the height of retaining walls and fences?
If I may, Your Worship, through to Councillor Lefebvre, I guess satisfying the issue is all one of perspective into what what Council's expectations are on that. What it would achieve is within the 1.5, for example, if we were to use a rear yard setback. So under our normal zoning bylaw, when something's 1.2 meters from a property line, you could build a 5-meter high building. The only thing that we currently have an exemption on are fences and retaining walls. When they're within that 1.2 meters between the property line and further into the property, they can be combined, their height, 2 meters plus the 1 meter. What the proposed draft would do is it would restrict the maximum height within that 1.2 meter setback area to the maximum 2 meters that is allowed for a fence. So if you had a 1 meter retaining wall and you were to build a fence within 1.2 meters of the property line, that fence would therefore be limited to 1 meter, because the combination of the two, they would be treated as 1 unit for height within that setback area.
Thank you.
All right, very good. Councillor Powell Davidson, I'm going to call it on this after that.
Thank you, Worship. I fear that the intent of my original question has got blurred. I don't agree with putting a blanket statement that where a retaining wall is 3 foot, the fence height should be no more than X amount of feet, let's say 2 feet for the sake of argument, so that the combined height of the retaining wall and fence is 5 or 6 feet. I don't agree with that, because there will be instances, such as the ones that initiated this discussion, where if you lower the fence to 2 feet, or lower the fence period, because the retaining wall was put in there to raise the grade of the property behind it, you're going to have the people who move into that property standing on the back of their property overlooking the neighbors. Now, that may not be desirable to people, to everybody who's moving into the lower property on the other side. What I would like to do is to have this redone so that there is an opportunity to work with the property owners who are on the lower side. They may want the fence to be super high and have it 10 foot so nobody in their backyard can look over the fence. They may want it to be 2 feet high so that the people in their yard can look over. I don't know, but I don't think that one blanket statement is going to fit all situations, and I know it won't ever fit all situations, but I just wanted to clarify that my intent was that we have something in this rewrite that allows for the opportunity to visit residents' situation. Take that into consideration, what each individual case might be.
I understand where you're coming from. You're talking about in those very specific situations where there may be that difference. I just don't see how you can write a bylaw that's that specific. It's going to be blanket. But go ahead, Mr. Russell. Given the scenario that was just painted by Councillor Powell-Davidson, what would occur with the newly drafted bylaw had it been put in place in that kind of a scenario?
If I may, Your Worship, in this case, the fence would have been required to be lower than it was constructed, unless someone applied for a variance permit, either through council or the Board of Variance if they felt there was a hardship, but it would most likely be to council, and that is the process to make an exception to the regulations. So, and in fact, in this circumstance, my understanding is they actually did not build to the full bylaw height. They did attempt to work with the neighbors, which would be basically what we would be telling someone to do, but at the end of the day, it's only the regulation that ultimately sets the benchmark. And then if someone wants an exception to that, there's a formal process, a variance process that someone could go through to get that formal blessing.
All right, thank you. So I am going to call it on at least this motion to receive. And Council, if you do want to make changes, then you're going to want to defeat this motion. The second portion is to maintain the status quo. So on that question, all those in favor of the motion to receive and to maintain the status quo? 2. All those opposed? All right, so the motion is defeated. I will entertain a new motion. Go ahead, Councillor Powell.
Thank you, Worship. And so I've heard what everybody said about the combination. I really heard what Councillor Powell-Davidson said about, so if you have a 4-foot retaining wall and added 2 feet on the other side, and that's an assumption that the other side goes right up to the top of the retaining wall. And I agree with Councillor Powell-Davidson, that would look pretty stupid, and it would feel pretty uncomfortable. So I'm looking to staff who understands the bylaw better than myself, that I'm hoping you are figuring out what we want. What would be the best way to word a motion to cover that?
Oh, you could kick it back to staff and have them try and come up with something slightly different. But go ahead, Mr. Manson, not to cut you off, Mr. Russell, but it looks like you have something to say here.
What I was going to suggest, Your Worship, is that if it was passed in accordance with the way Councillor Powell was originally suggesting, then that would prevent what happened at Humphrey to occur again. But in the reverse, as Councillor Powell-Davidson was suggesting, if somebody wanted to build a higher fence to protect their privacy, then they would be able to come to council for a variance. Stop it one way, but wouldn't necessarily prevent it from happening the other, with council's indulgent with a variance.
Unfortunately, though, if I'm the property owner in behind and I'm not happy with the shortened fence height, assuming this draft were put into place, I really don't have a process. It's only the property owner that really can seek a variance. So that is the reality, right? And I may not want to have a person standing over my head looking over a very short fence because of the retaining wall, right? All I can do is complain to the poor mayor, and the mayor is going to be stuck not being able to do anything about it. Go ahead, Councillor Greer.
Thank you, Your Worship. The only question I ask in the case of the Humphreys, why I realize they backfilled, but I don't understand why they backfilled so high. I mean, they backfilled like over 4 feet, and it wasn't that much of a grade to start with. They could have backfilled maybe 2 feet, and then that would have solved maybe the problem with the 6-foot fence. But they seem to overdo it as far as their backfill goes, and they filled right up to the top of the retainer wall. And I think that was way too much and probably not necessary. So I don't know who was overlooking that or how that come about, but I think that was the problem to start with, was the backfill was too high to start with. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to see you in a second, Councillor Neufeld. I'm just going to go to our CAO, and then you're next.
Two things, Your Worship. As far as the backfill is concerned, it was for drainage reasons, and I would suggest that you refer this back to staff to come up with some sort of solution.
All right, Councillor Neufeld, and then Councillor Morrison.
Thank you very much, Your Worship. In listening to all of this, and I agree very much with what Councillor Paul Davidson is saying, I think one of the issues here, and both Mr. Figueira and Mr. Russell has stated in a former council meeting that in fact the builder had not had permission and had not had any discussion with either of these gentlemen with respect to actually putting in a retaining wall at all. It was done. The grading was done, and in fact, a tremendous level of grading, approximately 4 feet, was put in. That significantly impacted the slope and the what he wanted to be able to do as far as the builder is concerned on those lots, made them far more valuable as far as house sales are concerned. If we look at the situation, it's really interesting. The people that initially contacted me on Humphrey have moved into a place on Mulberry, and virtually the same thing is there. But they walked into it, they looked at it, and behind their house on Mulberry is a retaining wall. And what has happened is that the builder there actually backfilled right to the top of the retaining wall again. I guess it's more a function not of concerning ourselves with the height of the retaining wall and the fence that goes on top of it, but ensuring that the topography doesn't get changed. It's a case that in looking at the planning for the subdivision and everything else, we actually look at the way in which the lands are used, the wetland in this case, and there is a tremendous amount of land, or at least a wetness in those lands. And in some cases, some of the houses have got some pumps that will probably be going 24 hours a day. It's a case that I can understand the position that Councillor Paul Davidson is taking, but I'm looking at more basically the requirement of preventing the need for, or the builder having to justify the need for a retaining wall at all. And that's the concern that I would have. And I think we have to be looking at the cause of the problem as opposed to just some of the symptoms that are showing up.
All right, thank you. Councillor Morrison.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I just wanted to bring forward, I know we've talked about having a 6-foot maximum, but you come up with a 4-foot retaining wall with a 2-foot wall on top of it. Now you have a 6-foot drop from the higher height down to those people's yards. But I think you're going to have an issue with safety in that regard. There's no way that you're going to pass a 2-foot fence with a 6-foot drop on the other side. I believe the grade was brought up in order to facilitate drainage down towards the middle of the property to stop the runoff from the entire property running into the 4 or the lots along Humphreys. So, I mean, obviously those have gone through engineering done for a reason. Yes, they need to be looked at, but for us to put a blanket height restriction on there, I think is going to come up with a lot more issues than we expect.
Oh, hold on a second. I had Councillor Lefebvre. You'll be next. Go ahead, Councillor Lefebvre.
Thank you, Your Worship. Again, through you to staff, it seems to me that this whole thing is turning into an extremely difficult situation, because the builder has to decide why and where the retaining wall is needed and what have you. And then after all is said and done, if there's an ability for an applicant to apply for a variance permit, it comes back to council anyway, does it not?
Mayor Worship.
Go ahead, Mr. Russell.
Through your Councillor Lefebvre. So if someone decides to, let's say they require a retaining wall that, let's say you had a height that only allowed a ½ meter retaining wall within a certain area on a property, and someone wanted a 1 meter one, then they would have to come to council for a variance under that type of scenario. So if you put a more stringent restriction in place, then if someone wants an exception to the rule, they would have to come to council for a variance unless they have a hardship. But one thing I do want to point out is that the solution to grade doesn't have to be a retaining wall. Sometimes people make a choice. There are multiple solutions to how grade is handled.
So if we're going to refer this back to staff, Your Worship, I think that those kinds of issues have to be taken into consideration.
I'm looking at Councillor Powell Davidson. You had a motion for us.
Yes, I do, Your Worship. I'd like to make a motion that council direct this back to staff after having hearing the discussion. I'm very confident they have a good idea of where our concerns are with this issue, and bring it back to council.
We have a motion on the floor. Do we have a seconder to refer this back to staff? Seconded by Councillor Neufeld. Discussion on the referral? Really shouldn't be any. All right, go ahead and vote. All in favor? Opposed? And that's carried. All right, we've referred this back. We'll carry this conversation on another day. Moving on to our second report, ladies and gentlemen. Once again, Mr. Russell, can you give us the background with respect to a consideration of a development permit for 452 Island Highway East?
If I may, Your Worship. So we have a development permit application for a facade upgrade less than $25,000 on the front of a commercial building on the highway. It's a fairly basic application to basically improve the appearance of the property.
So we have a two-part recommendation there, ladies and gentlemen, in council. First to receive and second to issue the development permit. Do we have a mover? Moved by Councillor Lefebvre, seconded by Councillor Morrison. Discussion on the now motion. Councillor Powell Davidson.
Thank you, Your Worship. First of all, I've said it before, I'll say it again, I applaud any business owner that carries through with facade upgrades in our beautiful little city, and I'm encouraging many of them to follow suit. My question, Your Worship, is through you to staff. I want to know if the advisory design panel will have a chance to have a look at the form and character of these upgrades.
Mr. Russell.
If I may, Your Worship, the applicant has requested that this application be forwarded directly to council for a decision on whether or not to issue a development permit. So as that is the case, no, it would not be forwarded to the advisory design panel unless council highlighted a guideline that they do not believe the proposal meets, wherefore they could refer it to the design panel for review. But that would be council's choice.
Thank you. Councillor Lefebvre.
Thank you, Your Worship. The reason I'll be supporting this is it's a $25,000 upgrade. I've gone to see the building, and I've looked at what the proponent is proposing, and I don't see the need for the design panel to look at this. It's going to be a very good upgrade, and it's going to look a lot better than it looks now. And again, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. For $25,000, I don't see what other comments or suggestions the advisory design panel might bring to the table for $25,000.
Any further discussion? All those in favor? Opposed? And that's carried. Thank you. Our next report is from Mrs. Comas, and this is regarding the 2014 Fall Grant-in-Aid applications process.
Yes, Your Worship. Twice a year, Council considers grant applications from community groups. Applications have been solicited from the community in accordance with the usual practice, and it's now time to appoint 2 councillors to form the Grant and Aid Committee to make recommendations to Council on the allocation of grant funding. The recommendations are as per the Council agenda.
All right, so you have a 3-part recommendation. I have some names here in front of me. I'm looking at all of the Grant and Aid Select Committees since 2009, and the folks that are due is Councillor Neufeld and Councillor Lefebvre. So if you gentlemen don't object, then we'll incorporate that into the motion and get this going if we have someone ready to move it. Moved by Councillor Morrison, seconded by Councillor Greer, and those were our spring Grant and Aid councillors that took care of that. So they're passing on the buck, literally. No, I'm not going to let you do that a second time. I know it was hard for you, Councillor Greer. All right, so we have a motion on the floor. Any further discussion? I didn't think so. All in favor? Opposed? And that's carried. Thank you. Back to our Director of Administrative Services. In this respect, it's regarding the fees and charges bylaw on item D. Mrs. Thomas.
Yes, Your Worship. A review of fees and charges has not been undertaken since at least 2007, and in some cases earlier than that. Fees for service are contained in a variety of bylaws and are not always easy to find, especially for members of the public not familiar with bylaw structure. As a result, staff is recommending to undertake a comprehensive review of all fees and charges to ensure they accurately reflect the cost or close to the cost of service provision, and to prepare a comprehensive bylaw which will be a one-stop shop for the public and staff to determine the fee for a specific service. The recommendations are as per the Council agenda.
All right, so we have a 2-part recommendation there, essentially to receive and then to undertake a review of the current fee structure. Moved by Councillor Paul Davidson, seconded by Councillor Greer. Any discussion? I'm sure we will once it comes back. So all in favor? Opposed? Carried. Thank you. All right, moving right along, ladies and gentlemen. The next item, of course, was removed from the agenda, so that jumps us into bylaws for 3 readings. And we have 1 bylaw for 3 readings this evening, and I'm looking for a motion that permissive tax exemption bylaw 2014-1513 be read 3 times. Moved by Councillor Greer, seconded by Councillor Morrison. Any discussion? All in favor? Oh, well, Councillor Neufeld.
Thank you, Your Worship. Actually, I would like to ask the question, how do we distinguish, and this is to whom you wish to deliver it, how do we distinguish between the lawn bowling club and the curling club? I mean, I look at it on a perceptual basis and think about the issue of perceived fairness, and I have a real concern, and this has been expressed to me by a number of the people from the curling club, and they say rather strong language that they just don't see it as being fair. Granted, we own the actual property, and we have a different lease with the curling club, the lawn bowling club, and it's through a second situation with respect to the RDN. But I guess it's the position that they see no difference in the end result of providing a social benefit to the community, to the people that come in and play, whether it's on a tournament or whatever. And the curling club is having, I know that I'm going to hear about this if we pass it at a 50% rate. So I'm somewhat concerned about that. And I would like to ask the question, how do we distinguish between these 2 organizations particularly, and in fact, what is the actual amount of money that is going to be paid by the curling club? What are they going to be charged? Is that the $6,000? We brought it down from $16,000 to $6,000. What is the actual dollar figure, please?
All right, so we have a couple of questions there. The first is with respect to the differences between the bowling club and the curling club, and why we are providing a 100% tax exemption to the lawn bowling club. And then, of course, a question related to the actual amount with respect to the curling club. Whom shall answer this? Mr. Manson or Mrs. Thomas? No, you can't, Councillor Greer. Looking for staff here. Go ahead, Mr. Manson.
If I may, Your Worship, unfortunately, neither of us have the appropriate spreadsheet in front of us to tell us the amount. It is in the $6,000 range that the curling club would be paying. As to break down to the penny, sorry, I don't have that in front of me. The difference between the two, as I think Council is aware, the lease that we have with the lawn bowling doesn't say that they have to pay taxes. So Council can certainly make it 50%. That would end up being that the city would pay not the lawn bowling. The way to make it so that we don't have to pay it would be to give them the 100% exemption until such time as the lease is up for renewal, change the lease, and then they would have the same 50% exemption.
So, Council, those of you who are attending may recall we had representatives from the Lawn Bowling Club here, Mr. Livingston, who did point out that they felt there was parameters within the lease that ultimately prevented them or the requirement to have to pay their taxes, and that was entirely correct, and we did have a meeting to that end internally, and that was determined to be true. So as Mr. Manson has indicated, Council could, by way of provisions within that lease, terminate the lease early and rewrite it in a way that would provide them the same advantage as anybody else, or we could leave the status quo for now. Answer your questions? All right, so further discussion, Councillor Lefebvre.
Thank you, Your Worship. Two further comments. First of all, the lease with the curling club is with the RDN. It's not with the City of Parksville, so that becomes an RDN issue as far as I'm concerned. The other thing is at the last council meeting, if council will recall, in the minutes of the meeting when we talked about permissive taxation, in spite of the fact that there's a cap and we've set new ground rules for permissive taxation, the permissive taxation level is still going up. It's going to go up from 2015, I think, to 180, something over 188,000. So it's still rising from what I can gather. So this is a situation that one of the reasons why we all adopted the new permissive taxation rules and regulations was because because permissive taxation was getting out of hand, and it was getting equivalent to, at one point in time, I believe, was almost a 2 or 3% equivalent to a 2 or 3% tax increase. So I think we should leave it at that for the time being.
Thank you. Any further comments? Councillor Greer.
Thank you, Your Worship. Initially, when we go back, because I was chairman of the advisory committee at the time, and the initial idea of permissive taxes was, one, to put a cap on it because it was increasing dramatically, and the other was to try to raise more revenue for the city. And that's why when we put the cap on it, then there was some more revenue for the city. However, when that went through, and it did go through, everybody voted for it. The fact was that then everybody got excited and said, well, we can't afford to pay that 50%. But since that time, they've had it all reassessed, and now it's down to very little. And as far as the lawn bowling goes, we were not aware that we had a contract until 2018. But at that time, we can rewrite the contract, but I would suggest we have to leave it the way it is for now until 2018. But at that time, we can rewrite it where they pay the taxes. But up until then, it's in their agreement that there's no taxes to be paid. So that's where it comes down to. It came down to 2 points. One was to put a cap on permissive taxes. The other was to raise some money by charging 50% or 100%, whatever it might be. And it was all approved. Both those situations were approved unanimously, I think. So that's the story on it.
So that is the story, although there are provisions within that contract. We could open it up. We don't have to wait till 2018, but I personally think leaving well enough alone is a good option too. So do we have any further discussion? Councillor Lefebvre, and then I'm going to call it.
Thank you, Worship. One further question. In looking at the list, and I've looked at the list, I should have done this before the meeting with staff, but I don't see Stanford Place mentioned anywhere for permissive taxation exemptions. Is there a reason for that?
Statutorily exempt.
Are they exempt?
They are fully exempt under law now. Remember, we were quite upset about that at the time. Okay, so seeing no further hands in the air, all those in favor, opposed, and that's carried. Thank you. All right, ladies and gentlemen, for these next two items, I'm going to have to declare myself in a conflict of interest, and I believe my colleague to my right will be doing so as well. Did you want to go ahead and formally declare that, Councillor Lefebvre?
Yes, I will, Your Worship. I'll be leaving the room.
All right, and that's, of course, related to items that relate to Parksville Chrysler. And I'm going to ask Peter Morrison, who's our Deputy Mayor, if he wouldn't mind chairing the meeting for the next little while, and then we will be waiting to come back when you say it's right.
Thank you very much, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We have two bylaws for final adoption tonight. Bylaw Offense Notice Enforcement Amendment Bylaw 2014 number 1486.2 and Zoning and Development Amendment Bylaw 2012 number 2000.82. Do I have a mover and a seconder for the recommendation? By Councillor Powell, seconded by Councillor Powell-Davidson. Any discussion? All those in favor? Opposed? Carried. I will pass it back to His Worship, the Mayor.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, that takes us back to the next section, which is new business. I have an item, but I think we'll go around the table. Is there any member of council that has any new business? All right, we'll start with you then, Councillor Powell-Davidson.
Thank you, Your Worship. This is more a question for you and a little bit of plug for Parksville. Yet in yesterday's Parksville Qualicum newspaper, I saw a little blurb in there about Parksville being nominated for Best Place in Canada. Do you recall that? Because I think you commented on that. Can anybody elaborate a little bit more? I can't remember exactly what it was called, but I just thought, we may as well take the opportunity to encourage people to vote for Parksville.
Right. Do we have a member of staff that could elaborate? Go ahead. I'm going to ask our communications officer, Ms. Tardif.
Thank you, Your Worship. The nomination was done by the Planning Department, actually, and the Great Places in Canada is part of the Canadian Institute of Planning, and it's an annual contest. So we nominated ourselves, and there is a news release that's going out tomorrow to encourage voting. We'll put a link on the website. It'll be in the City News page. So we nominated ourselves, and there is a YouTube video that Brody put together. And I hit them hard, and so the idea is vote as often as you can. You can vote once a day, basically. And then I think the way it works is the most popular places, and there's three categories. We're nominated in the public spaces category. They're the most popular, those that get the most votes then are the finalists, and that's determined by a panel of judges.
All right, very good. And we're going to throw something up on our website?
Tomorrow.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Yes.
The community park.
Community park, yes.
Yeah.
And my comment was more along the lines of just reminding everyone that that community park has already won international accolades through our Communities in Bloom program. It was actually voted the best waterfront park in the world at the time amongst a number of competitors. And I've seen several other awards in recent years all around that pretty impressive community park of ours. All right, that's good. Councillor Lefebvre?
Thank you, Your Worship. I want to bring something to Council's attention. It's not even in the city of Parksville, but it's not far outside the city of Parksville on Northwest Bay Road. And it's something that happened to me personally with an individual about 2 weeks ago. It's called the Workability Program. And it's at 2298 Northwest Bay Road in the News Bay. And what they do is the Farm at Cedar Woods is a nonprofit registered charity mandated to support people with barriers, physical, mental, emotional, to have a safe and meaningful, productive life within an environmentally sustainable community. The individuals go through life challenges such as mental illness and brain injury, can rebuild skills, reconnect socially, and improve their feeling of well-being. And I have a sheet here that I'll pass out to council later on this week, but it's quite an impressive program, and it was brought to my attention because Councillor Newfell and I sit on the accessibility committee, and this is right along those issues, and they seem to go above and beyond helping out people that need to or want to get back to work and can work in a learning environment. So I just thought I'd bring that to everybody's attention. It's called Workability Program, Pre-Employment Program.
All right, thank you for that, Councillor Lefebvre. Other members of council, Councillor Powell.
Thank you, Your Worship. I have two things for the agenda. One is the Ice Bucket Challenge. I challenged you and Councillor Lefebvre to the Ice Bucket Challenge, and I never got a response back. So I'm just curious about what
That was
you
quite
did.
intentional.
So you either have to make a donation or do the Ice Bucket Challenge. So that is out there. You missed your 24-hour deadline, so you can make a donation.
No, I will be making a donation, absolutely.
Thank
I've had
you very
multiple
much.
challenges, actually, and trying to avoid it very much, so
Yes.
I can't speak for
Well,
Councillor
now
Lefebvre.
you've been outed.
People tell me I'm all wet anyway, so I'll
Yeah.
make a contribution.
Okay, and the second one I have is another challenge. It's
By the way, thank you for that.
Oh, you're welcome.
Appreciate that.
I did it.
Yes, I know. I really wanted to say thank you. All right, carry on.
Yeah, I know. Could have. Anyways, the second one is the Sleep Outside Challenge from the Oceanside Homelessness Task Force.
I don't like where you're going
the
with this.
Oceanside Task Force on Homelessness Challenges, you sleep outside for one night on a Wednesday, October 15th. Challenge is designed to be a media event over there and to raise awareness around homelessness during the Homeless Action Week in BC. And I'd like to say for 4 years I've been sitting on the Homelessness Task Force, and this is the first year we've actually coordinated some events to happen during the Homeless Week. The Homeless Action Week, pardon me. By sleeping outside for one night, you will have a much more personal understanding of the conditions that some of our residents face every night. And you will have helped to bring the knowledge of homelessness to many other residents who are unaware of the extent of its existence here in the Oceanside area. On May 2013, Oceanside had 67 individuals who identified as being homeless or at risk of being homeless. 40% are over the age of 45 years of age. 75% indicating a physical or mental health disability. In addition, an average of 400 clients access the food bank every month. Homelessness can look very different from couch surfing to living out of a car to sleeping rough. Sleeping rough means you have little or no protection from the elements and leaves individuals highly susceptible to health issues. As a guideline, bring only what you can fit in a garbage bag or a backpack and no tents. We suggest a warm sleeping bag and something for a sleeping mat and layers of warm waterproof clothing. We will meet up at 6 p.m. the picnic shelter at the beach in Parksville and the Legion in Qualicum Beach. Breakfast will be provided the next morning. Thank you very much, whoever is going to do it, and I'll see you there. I'm in. And I'll pass
Yes,
out
sir.
to you so you get a copy.
Go ahead, Councillor Lefebvre.
On behalf of Councillor Greer, I'd like to know if there's going to be a washroom real nearby
Yes.
for sleeping outside. Thank you.
Yes, I've already asked that we have the washroom open in the park, which is more than people who are homeless get.
Actually, I think that's a pretty interesting challenge, quite frankly.
I think it would be a very interesting challenge. I've already got somebody from the fire department has stepped up to the plate. We're going to contact the Oceanside RCMP to see if they'll... I think it's really important, you know, we're going to have that breakfast in the morning. People who are homeless, they don't have that opportunity. And I'm going to do it, and I'm doing it with some reservation because I'm pretty old, and it's really hard to get up out of my bed in the morning. I don't know what I'm going to be like on that hard cement. So the challenge is out there. I challenge you, every one of you.
All right, well, you've got me. I will certainly join you on that one. Please hold your applause. Okay, moving on. Before we get into too much trouble here, is there any other member of council? Councillor Morrison.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Unless Councillor Greer wishes to increase it after his spiel earlier, I'd like to make a motion that we fund the Oceanside Initiatives Business Attraction Tool project for the amount of $2,250.
All right, and then I have a seconder in Councillor Lefebvre. So discussion on the motion on the floor. Seeing none, all in favor? Opposed? And that's carried. Any other member of council before I go into my little spiel here? All right, very good. So I just have two items. One is just an information item, just to make sure everyone's aware. On the 9th of September, thanks in part to our MLA, Michelle Stillwell, I'm going to be traveling to Vancouver to meet with Minister Oakes, who is the minister responsible and handling our file with regard to our water treatment facility and associated applications. I'm going to be meeting with her along with representatives from the regional district and also some staff from the city. This we felt was the best approach as opposed to meeting during the UBCM, because often at the UBCM these ministers are really overwhelmed with many different meetings, so this way we can spend a fair amount of time together in her office and talk in detail about the parameters and ultimately what we require. And hopefully after that time I will be able to provide a more detailed update for members of council. To that end, I also have another matter, and it is regarding the upcoming UBCM conference. I'm not going to be attending, and as a result, I'm going to require and ask for a member of council to be in my stead for the Municipal Insurance Association annual convention, which occurs during the UBCM. This is essentially our overall insurance association. I am your voting delegate, so to speak, for the city, and so this resolution that I'm about to read out would appoint Councillor Powell as our voting delegate just for that particular event. And it's actually a fairly straightforward thing, and it's done at every UBCM convention. So I need a motion that council appoint Councillor Powell as the City of Parksville voting delegate to the MIABC annual general meeting